Welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a 501c3 research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss interesting facts about each species. This is our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy the series, and be sure to follow us on Instagram to vote for which animal we talk about next. And without further ado, welcome to the PacMam podcast. I'm Cindy.
And I'm Kat.
And we are doing a marine mammal highlight. And of course, this is our, the summer is when we lose Trevor, who's normally with us on our marine mammal highlights, but he is out on the water quite a bit and is very, very busy. So we won't have him for at least the summer. We'll see after that. But so we'll miss him, but we'll try to take over his parts and have just as much fun. We're going to do, so this week, we had one of our listeners message us over social media and suggested the pilot whale that she really wanted to hear about. So we're like, great, that's awesome. So we put the pilot whale up against another we call blackfish, larger whales that are all black, are kind of in the term blackfish, including killer whales. And so we put him up against the false killer whale, and I thought it would be closer.
I know. I was a little bit surprised actually that it was like so heavily in favor of the winner, which was
false killer whale.
That's right. So Stay tuned. We will get to the pilot whale, I promise.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll put that on next time's poll and see if that wins out against something else.
Yeah, maybe we won't do another blackfish. Maybe we'll do something different.
Yeah.
But
since that
like,
one was,
it was like 68% to 32% or something like that.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive.
Yeah. No, I mean, they're both very interesting, and we're gonna have a lot of fun with this one. But we love that they, people are reaching out to let us know what they want to hear. So if you have a particular animal you want us to do, put it out there, and we'll put it up on the next poll.
Yeah.
So without further ado, the false killer whale, or the pseudorca, false killer whale. And Kat is going to start us off. So normally Trevor is the one who starts us off with the distribution and what they look like, but Kat's going to start us off with the kind of distribution where they are. Then I'm going to talk about what they look like and move on to the behavior. So Kat, take it away.
Yeah, so false killer whales are kind of cool in that they're found pretty much all over the world in tropical, subtropical, and temperate waters. So pretty much you're talking like basically with the exception of the poles and like a certain part of like northeastern South America, their range is potentially pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, I was impressed with the map where you look it up and you just have the flattened map of the Earth, and it's just like a big band of blue across the center. It just like covers all the waters.
And that is really that's a good point, because it is important to remember with these maps, like this is their potential distribution range. So that doesn't mean that they are definitely found in all of these locations all the time.
Right.
This is basically just where they could potentially go and where they have potentially been sighted. But they are generally more offshore or pelagic species. So they prefer water that's about 3,000 feet or deeper. They will hang out in some shelf areas and some more coastal areas, depending on the topography or the oceanography of that specific area.
Yeah, there's a big cliff next to the island. Will be found closer to the islands, but it's still in deep water. Yeah.
Right. So, but aside from that, like I said, they are fairly widely distributed. In the US specifically, they are often found most often actually in Hawaii, the waters off of Hawaii, the Pacific remote island areas, Alaska, up and down the West Coast, which they actually go as far north as BC in warm years, which I thought was really interesting.
Oh, interesting. That'd be so cool to see one up here.
Right. The Gulf of Mexico and American Samoa. And then they are also found in some of the warmer Gulf Stream waters off of the East Coast. So typically more kind of like the south to middle East Coast of the US. Once you get up into like the northern East Coast, they're less likely to be seen.
Yeah. And I'll talk about ones that I actually got to see in the behavior part, but they were in the Gulf Stream, but it was by Florida. So we were crossing from Florida to the Bahamas, and that's where we saw them.
Right, exactly. So that's typically more when they say the East Coast, that's typically more where they're talking about what, like I said, once you start to get further north, it's less and less likely to see them.
Right.
So with that, I will pass off to you for what they look like.
All right. So these guys are cool because what's funny is that their name is the false killer whale, but they don't actually look like killer whales, which
I mean,
I always thought,
you only saw their back. I could see it, like,
yeah,
I mean, kind of. I don't know.
kind of. I mean, they don't have huge dorsal fins either, like the big males do. But
True.
and they're a little bit. I mean, the dorsal fins are different, but like it's just kind of funny because you think like, oh, a lot of ones that have names similar to what they are supposed to look like do actually kind of look like that. These guys look very different when you're looking at their whole bodies. It's like, well, that's obviously not the same animal as a killer whale.
Yeah.
But the reason why they're called false killer whales is because of the similarity of their skulls, not their appearance. So the shape of the skull is very much like a killer whale, and so that's why they got called that. But they are genetically more closely related to Rizzo's dolphins and pilot whales, which was interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that's funny because we put them up against the pilot whale, so the two very closely related species that the false killer whale won. But they're dark gray, so they don't have any kind of white on them like killer whales do. Dark gray, almost looking black. And then they have a small part that's a little bit lighter on the underside between their pectoral fins that runs from the throat down to the belly. So they're a big blackfish, but not a fish. Don't get confused. The males are larger. They can get up to 20 feet versus only about 16 feet for females. So they're pretty chunky and can weigh up to 3,000 pounds. I think the average was shorter than that, less than that, but they can get that big for the big males. And then they are sexually dimorphic, which means that the males, sexually dimorphic means that the males and females look different, that you can physically see. Usually not like, you don't have to like look really fine tuned to find it. Like you go, oh, that's definitely a male, that's a female, just by seeing them kind of surface or on the water. But the front of the adult male's head hangs over their lower jaw more than females, and that front of the head can be flattened in older males, which I thought was interesting that they kind of morph, I guess. Like your head flattens as you get older. I don't know.
Like why?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I wonder. Okay, I'm just gonna restrain myself here before I start going off on a tangent. Never mind. Continue.
But those tangents can be really fun. But yeah, I'm not sure. And there wasn't really any explanation that I could find from that. But their pectoral fins are kind of unique because they have a hump that's on the outer edge of it, and it creates like an S shape. So I think I guess I think of it as like, oh, they're a bit more fancy in their flippers. And then individuals can be distinguished using scars on their dorsal fins, and this often comes from fisheries interactions, which I'll talk about, and I know Kat will talk about later. And then scars on their body from cookie cutter sharks. And that's not isolated to false killer whales. They use cookie cutter shark bites for identification of a bunch of different species, I think like including minkies and stuff. And you can also tell where an animal is coming from if they go to an area that doesn't have cookie cutter sharks, but they have cookie cutter shark bites on them, then you can tell that they came from some other location that has those shark bites, which is interesting. So they are able to identify individuals, which I'll talk about in a minute. And this was really cool. So they will get these scars and from those different interactions from either, they can get them from other false killer whales, right? If they're fighting and doing rape marks and stuff like that. So they can get these scars, but they actually they repigment. So they're still all black. But if you compare that to the Rizzo's dolphin, which they're closely related to, Rizzos are known for their rake marks and those scars, where the individuals start off dark gray and end up becoming almost completely white by the time they get to older adulthood. So in the Rizzo's dolphins, the scars pigment, with the way they scar, it either is like pink or white, and then it doesn't recolor. So I thought that was interesting. Like, why does theirs repigment, but Rizzo's don't?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of cool. And I've seen that on a horse before. We had they got a scar and it healed, and then like the hair came back white instead of like black.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was really weird. So I don't know if there's some kind of physiological reason for that or not, but interesting nonetheless. So that's what they look like. They're very kind of cool looking, I think. Their heads are
I think they're kind of friendly looking. I mean, I know that's horribly anthropomorphizing, but like,
they're so friendly.
I don't know. They just kind of look friendly. I don't know.
They do. Well, I think the shape of their head is a bit more torpedo-ish to me. And I think it's just a little bit different than many of the other cetaceans that have a more, less conical. They're very conical. And so I think that has to do it. They just kind of look different. And I agree. I think they're kind of fun looking. So moving into their behavior, there's some really cool stuff. And now I'm gonna preface this by saying that because of the oceanic nature, as Kat said, of the species, we don't actually know a lot about them because they're hard to study, right? They're out in the middle of the ocean in very deep water. And that is oftentimes not hospitable for boats and things like that. And so we don't know a lot about, I think, probably most of the animals in their range worldwide. Most of what we know comes from stranded or captive animals. There are a few captive ones, and then limited observations of groups around oceanic islands like Hawaii. So most of this behavior stuff that I'm going to be talking about, although when I read it, they oftentimes just say false killer whales do this, but most of that's coming from the Hawaiian Islands, I believe, especially some of the specifics that I'm going to bring up. So just keep that in mind. It's likely that they do these other places as well, but that this is particular to those closer associated to the islands. But they have very, very strong social bonds. So they are found in small subgroups of a few individuals that associate within a larger aggregation. And what's really crazy is that these larger aggregations from like 20 to 100 or more, possibly individuals, can be spread over tens of kilometers. So this gives a whole new idea of what a group is, you know?
That's interesting.
Yeah. So because, you know, defining a group is always important in your study. Like, what are you saying as a group? So these guys have this kind of other level where they've got these small subgroups, but then they can still be connected and rejoin with that larger group over hours or days later. And that's going to become important in a minute. So it's very interesting that they can have this very, very spread out grouping behavior. They're not distinctly grouped together, but they're still associated together, and then they come back and rejoin. So it's kind of an interesting social structure. But they do have definitive, especially again, that insular population around the Hawaiian Islands have been documented with definitive social clusters. So, and those clusters basically don't really interact with the other clusters. So very confined. They like their group, and they don't really want to hang out with anybody else. And they've had long-term associations of up to 15 years based on, you know, photo ID work. And
wow.
Yeah. So that's a long time in any population. And is, you know, who knows, could likely be very much longer than that. That's just what we've documented. And by we, I mean, not me. I mean, the wonderful people that are doing the work in Hawaii. And so what's cool too about this one is talking about these different populations, is that the false killer whales there are three different populations. There's the insular ones that are associated right close to the islands. There's, I think it's the northwest islands group, and then there's offshore, or the more pelagic group. So there's three different ones. They all are sympatric, so they overlap in their ranges living together, but they don't really interact at all. And then they looked at their vocalizations to see if they could differentiate between those three different populations based on their vocalizations. And they couldn't really, except that the Hawaiian Islands, the insular population there, those ones they could identify different than the others. So, and that one's smaller and it's endangered. So yeah, so I wonder if it's, you know, somewhat of a consequence of them being, they kind of isolated themselves, and then they lost a bunch of individuals, and they're further isolated. And so when that happens, you can end up, that's kind of how languages diverge, right?
Yeah.
You start having your own sayings for things, right? There's, you know,
you call what soda one place, you call it pop somewhere else, you call it soda pop in another part of the country. So I thought that was interesting that that endangered population next to the islands is, I think, a representative of their species, but also not, which is interesting.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. And so similar to killer whales, or similar to the southern resident killer whales that have that unique thing where the males and females both stay within their natal pod, right? The pod that they were born into, they stay with their mother their entire lives, both males and females, which is very unique in the mammal world. They just recently found out that in that endangered Hawaiian population, there's very strong natal social group fidelity for both sexes. So similarly, they stay with the pod that they're born in, which is cool and interesting and not normal. I mean, quote unquote normal, right? What normally happens in most mammal worlds. But they usually stay in the group they're born in, and that the issue with that becomes with inbreeding, right? If you're only mating within your group, you're more likely to have inbreeding, and that can cause genetic problems down the line. So they looked at that, and up to 64% of matings involved individuals from the same social group.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's a really good thing for their population over time, you know?
Right. Yeah.
But that kind of further reinforces that they do have very strong social connections. But these strong bonds can be a detriment because highly social species will sometimes strand in large groups if they follow the individual that's sick, or they stay with the individual that's sick, and then they all wash ashore. And blackfish, like pilot whales and false killer whales, are more commonly do that. And do you know guess what the largest recorded mass stranding was?
Ooh, let me guess. 2,000 animals.
Oh, okay. No, you're way higher. It's 835.
Oh,
yeah, which is still a lot.
Just desensitizing everybody so that it didn't seem terrible.
like, oh no, it's only 835. That's totally fine.
Oh my gosh. Can you imagine?
Yeah. Close to 1,000 animals. I mean, I couldn't even imagine the stretch of beach that would cover, you know? I mean, it's just.
Yeah. Well, just seeing footage of like 50 animals stranded seems like the entire beach is covered.
Exactly.
You know? Oh my gosh. Wow.
So those bonds are great, but that's the kind of the bad side of it. And I think most of the time those mass strandings, not many of them get refloated or pushed back in. And oftentimes, even if they do, they will just come back.
Yeah.
And we still don't know exactly why, but that's the unfortunate side. So we'll go past that now. Stop thinking about the sad part. But they're social with themselves, with their other false killer whales, or at least within their pods or their social groups, social clusters. But they're also seen with a variety of other cetacean species, so whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And most notably, they say bottlenose and rock-toothed dolphins are ones they're commonly associated with. I didn't really find much more than just that they do that. There wasn't any like cool, interesting stories I found, but still kind of cool that they seem to aggregate towards, or that's not the word. Anyway, they like to hang out with them. Gravitate, yeah, that's good. Gravitate towards those species. They can be quite active at the surface. They often will leap fully out of the water, and sometimes in the context of chasing after the fish that they're eating, which I'll talk about in a second, because they're pretty sporty fish that they're chasing out there. Yeah. But this is where I get to do my one cool thing that I got to see false killer whales in the wild. They are also similar again to the southern resident killer whales. They actually do prey sharing. So one animal will go and capture a fish, and they'll bring it to the surface and then share the prey with the individuals in the group, which I always think is just really cool. And because that's yeah, you don't really see it that often. I mean, generally because you're out there for yourself, right? I'm going to grab a fish and just eat it, and so you can survive. So it's always interesting to me when animals will choose to share with others, which could, it takes some of the food that they're going to get out of their mouths. So anyway, they do that, and we actually got to see this in Florida. So we were crossing the Gulf Stream to go to our study site in the Bahamas, and we wrote a paper on it. along with some other sightings that we saw in the Gulf Stream. But it was really interesting. We're there for about 2 hours, and we would see an animal go down and then dive down. And most of this group remained at the surface, kind of milling and surfacing slowly. And then 1 or 2 animals would dive down, and then they'd come up with a very large bloated fish. And we couldn't get close enough to identify the species before they ate it. But it looked like it was demersal, so one from the bottom, which would make sense if it's bloated by the time it came to the top, because it's coming up so quickly that the gases are expanding.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that we think it was from the snapper or grouper family. And what's really interesting is that they, at the surface, they took big chunks of it. You know, they took turns taking chunks off the fish and left only the gills.
What?
Yeah. So the only
They ate around the gills?
Yeah, they just like, that's what was left, like that in the inner portion of the gills. Yeah.
Wow.
And this the only good picture we got of the fish was the gills as it floated by the boat.
Wow, that's so fascinating.
Yeah, it was really, really neat. And so we observed 3 of those catches and consumptions within a 2-hour observation period. And then by that time it was getting dark and we had to get back to Florida. And then we also observed for the animals that were at the surface, some social behavior, including breaches and a couple spy hops. And then one was really cool. He came under the boat. Like we just had the boat off at that point. So, you know, we're just drifting and watching them. And he came under, and it was a catamaran. So he came under the boat. And so we became a trimaran with the false killer whale.
That's so cool.
It was neat. And you could actually hear them whistling above the surface. They were whistling and stuff. So that was super cool. So that's my claim to fame with false killer whales. It was very neat. But I get to see that prey sharing, which is very, very cool. So speaking of prey, they feed on both day and night and many types of fish. But like I said before, they're very sporty. So they like tuna. Mahi-mahi is very common for the ones in Hawaii, and also wahoo. And I don't blame them, because both mahi-mahi and wahoo are delicious. Some of the best white fish, if you've never had it. And they'll also feed on squid. And I found this really cool paper that, so they use echolocation like other dolphins and porpoises. So they use the echolocation to find their food, but they have the ability. So there's a false killer whale that I also got to see. I forgot about that when I went to work with my friends in Hawaii for a little bit. They have a captive false killer whale at that location at one of the labs down there. And so they did a lot of hearing tests and echolocation, vocalization, that kind of thing. And so they were able to show that she could hear her outgoing clicks much quieter and much quieter returning echoes at comparable levels. So she can basically, the end point of this is that they can adjust their hearing when they echolocate. So she can basically, what was it one down here? If targets are made smaller and harder to echolocate, the animal will modify what she hears of her outgoing signal as if to heighten overall hearing sensitivity to keep the echo level hearable. Because they're echolocating at the same time as they're receiving a lot of times. So they have the ability to, they say the animal has an active automatic gain control mechanism in her hearing. So she's able to adjust how she hears things to hear them better in the wild, which I thought was really cool.
Wow.
Yeah. You don't think about being able to adjust your hearing, right? You can adjust your voice, right? But not necessarily how your hearing levels are taken. So I thought that was kind of cool.
That is cool.
So their chasing can be quite exciting. They can leap out of the water. Again, they're going after these, larger game fish, which is another problem because people want the game fish as well.
Which
right. Kat will get into that. I'll give you a little teaser and then Kat will give you more in depth. So they'll oftentimes leap out of the water and even throw the fish into the air before eating it. They can dive for their prey. They can dive deep. We don't really know a lot about how deep they can go, but they have one tagged animal that dove for 12 minutes to over 230 meters. And again, they're doing it in deeper waters on fish that are usually found deeper. So it kind of makes sense. So in Hawaii, they are known to depredate the deep set longline fisheries. And these, again, these interactions can cause those dorsal fin damage that we talked about, and Kat will, I'm sure, talk about more. And I remind me to tell you an interesting fact about that when we talk about the longline fisheries, because I'm sure you're going to talk about that, right?
And I'm going to talk fisheries interactions. So yes.
Yes. So I have some interesting fun facts if you hadn't found them to add into that. So they can travel pretty far, and I'll mention that when we talk about the fisheries. But this is really interesting. I did not know this. I think this is the most interesting thing. Their dinner habits. They have been seen, though this is obviously rare, they've been documented feeding on smaller delphinids that are being released from tuna purse nets in the Eastern Tropical Pacific.
Yep.
Did you know about that?
I mean, I did when I was looking for fun facts.
Oh, dang it. Sorry. Do you have the rest of the other cases of interesting things they eat? Because I'll leave them if you don't.
Just continue, because that's probably just do it all now.
Right. So anyway, I didn't, that's crazy. I didn't know that they did that. They did have one case that they was predation on a humpback whale calf. And then they've documented them attacking sperm whales. So.
Yeah, I think I just had larger whales. So gotcha. Yeah. And they've been we may as well just talk about it now. Not only just consuming that, like actually eating, but they have been known and are known to attack other small dolphin species just in general. And they are also known to harass larger whales in general. So sometimes leading to consumption of those species, but also just they do seem like they're kind of feisty.
I was going to say jerk.
I mean, sure.
potato. I mean, if you're just like, it sounds kind of bully-esque, you're just like, I'm going to poke you for no reason, just because I want to do it, but that's anthropomorphizing.
Oh.
So they do. Yeah, I think feisty is probably a better word. They do seem to be a bit, but interesting that they, in some, with the bottlenose dolphin interactions, it was specifically not aggressive. So very interesting that with some they're friendly with, others they're not, and then some they eat. So who knows? They've got some interesting relationships. Are you going to talk about age at all in your fun facts?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just stick to reproduction. They become sexually mature around 8 to 14 years of age, though it's thought that males could mature later. But what's really interesting is that one source I saw said that could be even 8 to 10 years later. So they might not become sexually mature, the males, until maybe 16 to 20 years of age, which is interesting. And then their gestation is 11 to 16 months. Now, I find this very strange that it's that wide of a range. And I don't know if that's the legitimate range that it can happen in, or we just don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just thinking though, like they're so wide ranging that it could even be there are slightly different ranges based on where they are in the world.
True.
Potentially. I don't know, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, that's very true. That could possibly be. It could be a factor of all those things, right? So there might be some variation and then we just kind of don't know. So we just put that whole range. So they have a fairly long gestation and they nurse their calves for about 1.5 to 2 years. The calves can happen year round, but oftentimes peaks in late winter. But how often they give birth, they don't know. They don't know what the interbirth interval is, but one estimate is every 7 years.
Yeah, I think that was what I saw, was like every 7 to 8 years.
Yeah, which is a long time, especially if you're only nursing for like up to 2 years. Because even dolphins will have, will nurse 2 to 3, sometimes up to 4 years, but the interbirth interval is 2 to 3 years. So it's interesting. But females will enter menopause, like killer whales do, around 45 to 55 years of age when their reproduction kind of goes down. So there's still a lot to learn about their reproduction. Well, a lot of their stuff, but it's, especially the reproduction, don't know too much. But that is what I have for their behavior and fun stuff. So we're going to take a quick break and we'll be back for Kat to depress us, but then make us happy with the fun facts, as we always do. We'll be right back. And we're back. Okay. And Kat, take it away with the not so great part to the great part.
Yeah. So first of all, we'll get into a little bit of just about their current status. So like we've already mentioned a few different times, basically we don't know. So because there's literally no global population estimate for false killer whales because they're not really, again, it's just very difficult to study these animals and get a real estimate of what their numbers are because they live offshore. So again, you know, kind of similar to Cindy, what she was talking about earlier, like we do have more specific estimates for some of these coastal populations. So generally, false killer whales are listed by the IUCN as near threatened. They are not particularly common in any of their ranges. And because we don't actually know what the population status is, and we do know that there are a couple of populations that are quite endangered, it kind of seems like a nice conservative estimate to assume that they might be getting close to being threatened, but we're not quite sure, basically. Right. So as Cindy mentioned, that Hawaiian Islands insular population, that one specifically is listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act and depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And it's thought that there are less than 200 individuals left in that population.
Yeah, I have the population declined from over 400 to around 150 between the 80s and early 2000s. So pretty quick.
Yeah. And again, like it's important to note that we don't actually know how large the population used to be. We know what, we know what those early aerial surveys were when they kind of started doing those. So that's, again, that specific population we do know is under threat, and I'll get into that actually right now. Let's get into the threat right now. So actually, let me just talk about that one first, since we were just referencing that population. So one of the big ones is small population size for these guys. And so basically, when you have such a small population size, one of the qualities of this population is that they are insular, right? Like they don't actually breed out of the population. So the diversity of their genes is going to be very limited.
Yeah, they're not even going in between the social clusters of that insular population. They're staying within their social cluster. So it's even
right. So
more.
there's a concern that this could end up in basically a genetic bottleneck where they're only breeding within themselves, and it's basically, that means that you're not getting any new genetic diversity coming into the population. So this can result in higher mutation rates and or potential susceptibility to disease outbreaks as well.
Right. And so what's interesting though is that recently the vaquita, the critically endangered vaquita, that there's only 10 left, they're also very isolated, but they've been so for such a long time that the geneticists that have looked at their DNA, they basically don't have any really bad genes that would become more prominent in inbreeding. So they think that they could still survive with so few individuals. So I wonder if that, I wonder if that would be, if they're, since this population we think maybe has been smaller than other ones, if that also would be the case or not. You know, that's something that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know.
If you already have no bad genes, then it doesn't really matter if you're mating
right.
with each other.
Yeah, no, that's true. And then one of the other things that small population sizes can potentially mean, not in every case, but it can also potentially mean intensified competition for food in that region, because you're basically competing with your neighbors all the time. Right. And you're not going anywhere else for food. So any food that's there has to feed all of you. So that can be a potential issue. So that's one of the threats. Prey depletion is another one. And this kind of goes back to this where we're getting more into the fisheries stuff. So because there is such close proximity to these fisheries operations that the false killer whales are in competition with, that means that basically they are in direct competition with those fisheries for their food.
Right.
So as there's a greater fishing effort, that means there's less food in the ocean for the whales. So prey depletion is a potential threat. As far as I know, it's not necessarily one they're super concerned about right now, but because they are fairly generalistic with their prey, but they have multiple options at least. But it is one that might become an issue as fishing effort intensifies. And then the most common threat that we've already mentioned a couple times now is that interaction with fisheries. So again, like Cindy already mentioned, they're coming into contact with these larger fishing vessels. They're directly competing with them for the same fish species. And this is the other thing too, where they're not just dealing with the large fishing vessels offshore, they're also dealing with those coastal fishing efforts in the island areas. And again, like they will literally take bait off of fishing lines.
They're good at it.
And they can regularly get hooked on the fishing line, which results in what's called an accidental take of the false killer whale. They can obviously become injured from this, or even maimed or killed by the fishermen who are trying to get them off the hooks.
Right. So yeah, lots of them, they will shoot at them and other things to try to save their catch.
Yeah. So, and that's the biggest thing. And that's actually, it's interesting because it's almost similar to the dynamic between fishermen and seals in a lot of ways, where they're seen as a pest. And seen as they're obviously kind of are a pest, honestly. They're directly taking the catches off the lines.
Right.
Like they are kind of, so this has led to another threat, which is active hunting of false killer whales in several areas of the world still. So this includes Japan, Indonesia, and the West Indies. And in a lot of those places, that's partly why they're targeting that species, is because they are prevalent in those areas and they are seen as a pest and pesky for the fishermen. And they're basically like they're taking our prey.
Yeah, it's like, let's go out and kill the coyotes because they're taking the cattle before they take the cattle. Yeah. I have something quickly before we move off the fisheries interactions. I found a paper that just came out from the group that's working down there in Hawaii, that they were looking at what behaviors can they see or figure out are associated with fishermen with the depredation, so that they could like figure out like how can fishermen also adjust their behavior to knowing what the killer whales are doing, the false killer whales, to be able to avoid that depredation event. And what's interesting is that they looked a whole bunch of different stuff, but the risk of the biggest thing that they found was that it was if you're going to get have depredation event occur, it's more likely to have happened if it had already happened. Doesn't make any sense, but basically they will stay with a boat, and so they'll do depredation and then they'll do it again to the same boat.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So it was, but like no other factors really worked into that, but except for that. So they showed that the risk of depredation decreased with both space and time from a previous occurrence, with the greatest benefits achieved by moving 400 kilometers away or waiting 9 days, which reduced the occurrence of depredation from 18% to 9%, which is a big reduction. They found that fishermen moved a median of 46 kilometers and waited 4.7 hours before following an observed depredation interaction. So they do try to get away from it, but it's not long enough or far enough away that the animals can still find them. And satellite tagged pelagic false killer whales moved up to 75 kilometers in 4 hours and 335 kilometers in 24 hours, suggesting they can very, very much keep pace with the longline vessels. And so they're basically following them. So once they've got like, okay, they're fishing, we're just going to hang out with these guys and keep fishing when they're fishing.
Why would you not? If you know that's a guaranteed source of food, of course.
Exactly. Like it's totally smart. So I thought that was really interesting that it's basically, if they find you better just wait a long time or move far away. And so is that feasible for the fishermen to do? I don't know. I don't know if that's a feasible thing for them to adjust their behavior to reduce the predation events.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of running for them.
Yeah, and that's gas. That's, so they recommended fishermen avoid areas of known depredation or bycatch by moving as far and as quickly as practical, especially within a day or two of the depredation event. So basically, if you know that another boat has gotten it, don't go there. Go somewhere else, farther away, kind of thing. So it was cool. It was a cool study looking at the behavior of the false killer whales and the behavior of the fishermen to figure out how we can adjust and fix the situation.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
So the last threat that I have was just one that we've, actually I lied, I have two, sorry.
Dare you.
So one we've already talked about, so I don't need to go into detail because Cindy already talked about it, which was the mass strandings.
Right.
And then again, just contaminants. So as a top predator, again, particularly eating those larger game fish, which that anytime you're eating larger fish, you are more at risk of bioaccumulation of toxins, and they're also exposed to a lot of toxic substances in their environment as well, especially because they are hanging out next to a lot of boats, which are potentially, there's potentially runoff from the boats, or like there's gas contaminating the water. Exactly. So that is another one that they are at risk of, especially mostly because they are eating those large game fish, and not necessarily offloading the contaminants.
Yeah, because I mean, like they're eating tuna, and like we get warned about eating tuna because
so things like mercury are very high in those larger game fish.
Where you eat on the food chain makes a difference.
Yes, for sure. So some fun facts. Their scientific name, because we all know I like doing that. Their scientific name, which is Pseudorca crassidens, means thick tooth, which is reference to their pointed teeth and fierce predatory behavior in the open oceans.
Well, that is very fierce.
Yeah,
for sure. That makes sense.
Yep, I thought that was cool. So they can live up to 60 years old, with females typically more long-lived than males. And the oldest female was 63 years old, and the oldest male was 58. So a pretty long lifespan for being so active in the, just like how openly active they are at the surface and stuff, and chasing those larger fish.
Yeah, it is. And the fact that the female and males are so close. Like usually males live less long because they're, fighting and running around and being more risk prone. And
also can't offload those contaminants. So that's another one talked about a lot with the orcas up here, is that the males are actually typically more contaminated than the females, because the females can offload it to their young.
Exactly.
So, yeah. They can swim up to 18 miles an hour, which is 29 kilometers an hour. However, it's thought that their typical speed is closer to sort of between 8 to 10 miles an hour. Which is 15 kilometers an hour. So again, it's pretty speedy. And like you said, they're chasing those sporty fish. So that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, they got to be able to be fast.
And so my claim to fame with false killer whales is that they were the subject of my master's thesis. So I spent hours and hours and hours and hours listening to D-tag recordings of false killer whales from the Bahamas. Which was very cool, because you got to, like, the D tags are suction cup tags that are actually physically attached to the animal. So it was actually really cool, where you could hear that when they break the surface, you could hear it. So I kind of felt like I was swimming with a dolphin. It was really cool.
That's really cool. Because they are in the dolphin family. They're like killer whales. They are technically a dolphin.
Yep, they are. Yep, exactly. And so they do, again, it makes sense, as a very social species, they do produce a wide range of vocalizations. So this includes clicks, buzzes, burst pulse calls, whistles, and click trains. And my master's thesis was specifically looking at whether some of these burst pulse calls were actually stereotyped, which means they are using them over and over again, likely as part of some. Well, it's all communication for the most part, but that specifically is more of a recognition and or part of a cultural language. So spoiler, they can, and they are. They do,
which makes sense with their social clusters and how they're tightly connected. Like that, again, in what we talked about before, it makes sense.
And it's very, again, they are related to orcas, which we know have very sophisticated vocalizations that have direct cultural dialects. They use the same calls within a specific clan. So it makes sense for sure. But that was my interaction with false killer whales. It was very cool.
That's very cool. I have one real quick one. I actually didn't know that until I saw the paper, that one of my friends and colleagues did this. She does a lot of captive work with cognition, and they did mirror image processing in killer whales, false killer whales, and California sea lions. So basically the mirror test to see if they recognize themselves versus other. And they showed that killer whales can anticipate it, basically. And that they didn't investigate the false killer whale as in depth as the killer whale ones, but the mark test, where you basically put a mark on an animal and then you give them a mirror and you look to see if they look to see where the mark was, so they know that the mirror reflection is themselves. And that mark test on killer whales suggested that the marked animal anticipated that its image would look different, And the study shows that killer whales and false killer whales, like bottlenose dolphins, appear to possess the cognitive abilities required for self-recognition.
Gotcha.
So
Which makes sense.
Cool.
Just with their relatedness to both of them, that makes.
Yeah. So they're highly intelligent, highly social, highly fierce predators.
So some more fun facts for you. Wasn't able to verify this one, but I think it's cool, so I'm going to include it. And if anyone knows it happens to not be true, let me know, but I'm pretty sure that's probably true. I did find something that said that the false killer whale was first described in 1846 as a species of porpoise based on a skull, which was that is when the first carcasses were observed in 1861. So again, if anyone wants to dispute that, please let me know, because I was not able to verify it, but I thought it was very interesting, especially given our work with porpoises. So I wanted to include it. I
think I might have heard something like that. It may not be that. It may have been something else, but I know there was one that I saw that was like, oh, they thought it was this based on just a small, like a skull or something like that. And then they found the big thing and they're like, oh, no, it's actually that. Okay, just kidding. But
yeah, I mean,
that's a big porpoise.
Right. And I mean, that's the thing where, I mean, back in 1846, who knows how much of a distinction. I mean, we know at that point they weren't distinguishing between dolphins and porpoises. It was all just porpoise or a whale. Right. So I guess it's smaller than all the large whales. So maybe they just assumed, oh, it must be one of those smaller things. That's a porpoise. Cool. Whatever.
Or they found a juvenile, a young juvenile that would have been
true. Yeah.
Adult porpoise size.
Yeah. Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to share was just, again, a lot of you probably already know about this, but the false killer whales are able to successfully breed with bottlenose dolphins in captivity, which result in offspring called wallfins.
The wallfin!
So these offspring are fertile, which is fairly rare for different species interbreeding. Oftentimes they can, like a mule, right? They can have an offspring, but that offspring cannot reproduce beyond that point.
Right.
So just some couple of fun facts about wallfins. So they have dark gray skin, which is basically kind of a hybrid coloration of the lighter gray of the bottlenose dolphin and the darker, almost black of the false killer whale. And they have 66 teeth, which is the middle number of its parents, because bottlenose dolphin have 88 teeth and false killer whales have 44 teeth.
What? They're like right there. That's crazy.
How cool is that? I mean, on average.
Right. Like, I mean, yeah, everybody's gonna have slightly
9 teeth, but like, isn't that cool?
That's pretty interesting that it literally lands right in the middle. Like usually it's somewhere in the middle, but to be right in the middle is a little bit too on the nose, guys. Come on.
I know. I was very impressed. So anyway, those are my fun facts for false killer whales.
So, and you can look at you look up wallfin. It's WHOLFIN, and you'll see it there. It was in captivity. So that's the other thing about the wallfin. Maybe it doesn't happen in nature. Or maybe it does because they hang out with bottlenose dolphins all the time. But specifically, that one was in captivity, where there's a false killer whale and bottlenose dolphin in the same tank. And then the reason why they know it's fertile is because that hybrid mated back with a bottlenose dolphin and had a baby. So. So you look them up. They're super cute because they have like a little bit of a beak, because false killer whales don't really have a beak, but bottlenose dolphins do. And so this one has like a kind of one in the middle, and it's super cute.
Yeah. And I did read something that said that they have not been able to confirm any wallfins in the wild. I think a couple of potential reported sightings, but they weren't able to confirm it.
Yeah, that's the only one I know of confirmed. Yeah, that for sure is that one in captivity. And that may be, and then that kind of goes to reproductive isolation, right? So they can interbreed, but often maybe just don't in the wild because they don't really ever have the chance to. They don't overlap enough of the time for that to happen. So there's different ways to be isolated reproductively from others, whether that be physical differences or spatial differences or temporal differences, that kind of thing. So but the wallfin is very cute, so I suggest you look it up. Maybe I'll put a link to it in the notes.
Yeah,
that would be fun. All right, so I think that covers it for the false killer whale. This one was super fun, and I honestly thought that we knew more about these guys than we do, but there was some really cool, interesting facts, and they're doing great work. It's actually Cascadia Research Collective, and I think other colleagues are the ones that are doing the work down in Hawaii. So you can follow them. They have lots of great pictures and stuff on social media when they're down and see these amazing encounters that they have. So. They're doing some great work down there and learning a lot about these false killer whales that we need to learn more about. So check them out. And that does it. So I think next time episode, we'll probably back to a journal review. And we'll pick out a good paper for you guys. And if you have any suggestions, something that you want us to talk about, feel free to reach out and let us know. Don't forget that we have a shop on our website where we have stuffies and shirts and hats and other fun goodies that you can get, and all the money helps support us in our research and to bring you fun stuff like this, like the podcasts. So see us on Facebook and social media, and Facebook and Instagram, and check out our website, pacmam.org. And that is it for this week. So we will see you next time.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.